Tonight, we're traveling so far back in time that thunder had not yet learned our names, an age when some storms didn't last hours or days, but lifetimes. Imagine rain stitching the sky to the earth for generations, rivers rewriting continents, and clouds becoming the season that never ended. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Then settle in, soften your breathing, and let the steady rhythm of deep time carry you toward rest. Because the most surprising thing about these prehistoric tempests is not how fierce they were, but how softly they changed everything. Picture a young Earth breathing slowly, its continents adrift like dark rafts on a warm, bright ocean, mountain chains still tender at the edges where stone meets sky. The air holds a sweetness of vapor, a weight that gathers above valleys and shelves of shore, and the wind moves, as if remembering instructions given long ago. Nothing rushes. The sun is steady, but heat pools unevenly upon land and water, and the difference becomes a whisper that calls the clouds. At first they come in families, low and tireless, their bellies heavy with promise, and they take up residence over river mouths and inland basins, above forests that drink without counting. Storms arrive politely, then persist, then linger until the idea of clearing feels quaint, a relic from some other age. Days blur into a soft grey room where distance shortens and sound carries, and the ground begins learning to speak rain as a first language. Imagine listening to thunder that doesn't perform, that doesn't startle, but behaves like a drum deep in the next valley, steady and familiar, guiding the pace of everything else. Lightning is no longer an exclamation, it is script, repeated so often that cliffs flinch less with each stroke. Along slopes, thin threads of water become braids, and braids become broad ribbons that hesitation cannot cross. The rivers grow shoulders, then whole floodplains, easing outward with each season that refuses to relent. Water forgets its edges and tries on the shapes of meadows, forests, and old seabeds sleeping just below the dust. Boulders lift fractions of an inch while the ground around them liquefies, and the slowest landslides in history begin their patient migrations. What feels like a deluge in a moment becomes, across centuries, a sculptor's touch, smoothing the jawline of continents. Beneath the canopy, the world shrinks to the radius of a fallen trunk. Leaves glisten and droop from the constant sip. Ferns broaden like hands learning to hold more light, and moss climbs every surface as if gravity is only a suggestion. Insects practice the music of humidity. Wings hum, shells click, a quiet riot under the rain's soft hiss. Amphibians carry mirrors of the sky in their skin, and every footprint fills before it can dry. The air tastes mineral, green, and faintly metallic where lightning writes its short-lived letters. Soil breathes in and out with each saturation, making space for roots that do not dig but coax their way forward. Seeds stay ready for weeks longer than they need to, and patience becomes a strategy written into their small instructions. On the wide flats where rivers wander, the land is never the same 2 years in a row. Channels split as thoughts do, braid, abandon themselves, and return in altered form. Sediment, ground fine by stubborn rains, moves like a rumor through the system, settling wherever the energy slackens, rising again when flood pulses press forward. Deltas advance into shallow seas with a confidence that feels almost cheerful. They open like fans, lay down a stage for future forests, future insects, future paws and hooves. Even the sea, that great keeper of boundaries, must allow the negotiation, letting fresh water rest atop salt, letting nutrients bloom, letting nurseries form where the water forgets its lineage for a time. Tides come and go, but the weather does not. And so the coastline edits itself in sentence after sentence, polishing clauses, swapping commas for semicolons of sandbar and shoal. Higher up, along young mountain flanks, the rhythm is different, but no less patient. Fog keeps its own counsel, sweeping in and out like a tide of cloud, condensing on needles and bark until droplets gather enough courage to fall. Runnels etch hairlines into bedrock. Freeze and thaw play a long, careful game, and stones answer by becoming smaller stones, then gravel, then the powder that makes rivers opaque and fertile. The palette is subdued, slate, pine, the silver of water seen through curtains of water. Sound travels oddly. Eagles call from close and appear far. A rock slide sounds distant and is suddenly there, and everything is measured against the continuous note of rain on leaf, rain on stone, rain on water, already thick with rain. Pause anywhere in this geography, and the same sentence goes on writing itself around you. Underneath all of this, the archives gather. Each season deposits a thin page, then another, until the book thickens. A quiet lake in a long-lived basin receives silt of uniform grain, unbroken by drought markers or wind-blown dust, the laminae stacking like the grooves of a sleeping creature's breath. In swamps, peat layers record plant after plant agreeing to decompose slowly, a choir of damp voices speaking in carbon. Shorelines shift and leave behind strand lines that repeat at different elevations, stairways for future eyes to climb. Even cave mouths collect the memory of drip and flow. Stalagmites grow fat with the chemistry of endless wet, their bands as clear as rings in certain trees that never once knew fire. The record is not hurried. It does not persuade. It simply accumulates, confident that someone, someday, will read. Life adapts in gestures both subtle and grand, leaves thin to let more pallid light through. Roots spread shallow to catch nutrients flushed again and again from above. Some creatures grow webbing where none existed. Some trade speed for stability. Some find safety in the vertical. Branches, bluffs, the undersides of logs rotting sweetly in the quiet. Predators learn the map of flooded paths and teach their young, who remake the lessons when the river redraws them next year. The old cycles, breed, feed, hide, rest, continue, but their timing stretches, reshapes, synchronizes to the longer metronome set by an atmosphere content to hold its water. In places where lightning favors the same ridge or tree, communities rebuild and relocate as ritual rather than emergency. Resilience becomes less a response than a culture. In the human imagination, storms are events. Here, they are environment. Not something to wait out, but something to live within. If we could stand in that age, we would adjust our muscles, our calendars, the tempo of our speech. We would wrap ourselves in fibers that dry slowly because nothing dries quickly. And we would develop a vocabulary for the 1,000 kinds of wet. The feathered drizzle that blurs distance, the thick-rung shower that turns paths to streams in minutes, the sideways rain that teaches you to lean, the bell jar stillness before a slate sheet descends. We would learn the reflection habits of the ground, how the sky pools in puddles so perfectly that stepping in them feels like stepping through a second horizon. We would watch shorebirds pick new beaches in landlocked places and accept it without surprise. The strange would become ordinary. The ordinary would lengthen until it felt like law. And the sky, always the sky, would keep its chores. Low pressure would knit itself again from the warmth of an open ocean, ride the invisible tracks drawn by currents of air, and settle where topography welcomed and held it. The same clouds would return by different names, an old friend in a new coat, and the same thunder would rehearse its steady line, as dependable as a heartbeat heard through a wall. When rarely the ceiling thinned and light came through with edges, creatures blinked and stilled and then went on as before, because the rule of the world remained unchanged. Somewhere, far out over a basin already full, raindrops met other raindrops and became something heavier, and the long conversation between sea and hill resumed, the words patient and familiar, the meaning carried forward without hurry. We learn to listen where words have never been, following quiet instructions the earth left for anyone patient enough to read them. A cliff face becomes a library, a lake bed, a ledger balanced to the grain. We split a slab, and there, as thin as breath, lie bands upon bands of silt and clay, laminae so fine the fingertip barely feels them, yet regular enough to count like heartbeats. In years of ordinary weather, those pages often arrive in tidy couplets, a coarse pulse for spring melt, a finer veil for the still water of summer, a pause for winter's silence. But when storms become residents rather than guests, the handwriting changes. The coarse strokes thicken and run together, the fine lull fades, and long stretches of dark, organic rich matter speak of lakes churned and rivers that would not rest. The story is not a sentence here and there. It is a paragraph that continues for meters of rock, unbroken by the crisp commas of drought. Cores lifted from the bottoms of old basins carry this persistence in cylinders of memory. We cap the ends, label the years, and lay the cores in cool rooms where the past can be unrolled by millimeter. Under a stereoscope, grains reveal their travels, quartz sand with rounded corners, scoured until it forgot its mountain, flakes of mica that flash like dragonfly wings, clay so fine it behaves like smoke made solid. Between them, tiny worlds appear, diatoms with glassy shells that bloom in waters kept fresh by constant inflow, ostracod carapaces hinting at salinity shifts, pollen grains folded like sleeping fists, each from a plant that knows what it means to live in shade and gentle cold. The assemblages tilt toward wet-loving species. The percentages of swamp trees rise. Spores of ferns explode in abundance, as if the canopy had draped the entire valley in moss-green curtains. In caves, time drips its own archive. Stalagmites grow from the patient counting of drops, each one delivering a microdose of dissolved rock and a faint chemical signature of the cloud it fell from. We slice a pillar and polish it until it shines, and inside are rings no tree could manage, bands that thicken when the ceiling above weeps more freely, that thin when water hesitates. Ratios of oxygen within those bands, the subtle balance between heavier and lighter variants, shift with temperature and with the sheer amount of rainfall, giving us a whispered index of wet abundance. Trace elements ride along as marginalia, magnesium, strontium, uranium, each responding to pathways water takes through soil and stone. When the world above locks into long rain, the cave keeps pace, writing layer after layer of generous, even bands that say the drip never missed its appointment. On coasts and continental shelves, the seabed keeps a different kind of diary. Clay minerals sourced from deep weathering, smectite, kaolinite, arrive in volumes that swell when landscapes soften under persistent downpour. Grains sort themselves by the vigor of the water that carried them. During ages of patient flood, the record skews toward the fine, toward deliveries so steady that the sea stacks them into blankets rather than dunes. Farther offshore, organic-rich strata, sapropels in certain seas, darken the sequence, episodes when rivers fed the ocean, such a banquet of nutrients that oxygen thinned and preservation became easy. Foraminifera, the tiny architects of calcium cities, change their cast. Warm brackish lovers move into corridors newly carved by freshwater plumes, and their shells, once they fall, fix the moment in carbonate script. On land, soil remembers with color and texture. Glade horizons, those blues and greys born when iron spends too long without air, spread wide beneath floodplains and valley bottoms. Mottles of rusty red and olive-green freckle profiles where water hovered and receded, never committing to dry. The structure slumps toward massive, blocky shapes. Wormcast and root channels fill with fine silt that arrives softly, repeatedly, not by catastrophe, but by insistence. In some places, lateritic crusts soften at the edges because rainfall carries iron downward without pores, painting cross-sections in watercolor rather than ink. Paleosols, fossil soils now lifted into view by the slow gymnastics of crust, stack like neighborhoods, each showing, in its chemistry and fabric, a long spell of wet living that once felt routine. Wind is a faithful witness too, especially when it is quieted. Loess, that fine dust blown from distant drylands, dwindles in the layers that coincide with rain's long tenure. Ice cores, where they exist within the reach of our drills and within the time frame of memory that ice affords, show parallel declines in dust flux, the air itself swept and rinsed by landscapes too well watered to surrender much silt to the sky. Even in the absence of such frosted archives, desert margins tell us when they loosened and when they gripped. Dune fields cross-bedded with exuberance go still, their angles softened by crusts of moisture, loving microbes, and the faint sheen of film fungi that stitch grains together when showers return too often to be called weather. Rivers redraw their signatures on stone, and we read those signatures as we might an artist's evolving hand. The geometry of channels captured in ancient cut-and-fill sequences shifts from high-braided chaos toward more stable, sinuous forms, as discharge steadies at high stages for uncounted years. Overbank fines pile thick between crevasse splay tongues, a rhythm that says, again and again and again. Floodplain lakes, oxbows abandoned but never lonely, silt up in patient gradients rather than abrupt pulses. Wood fragments embedded in these packages carry the absence of fire in their tissues. Charcoal, when it appears at all, thins to a whisper, another hint that the sky behaved like a shroud rather than a spark. Even the chemistry of ancient leaves, long since freed into waxes that outlast the leaf itself, preserves the flavor of old rains. Hydrogen isotopes in those plant waxes skew lighter when storms recycle ocean moisture in such volume that evaporation's fractionation matters less. Entire hillsides of shrubs and trees record that bias in their skins, which then flake, wash, and settle into the same lake beds whose valves tell us independently that monotony ruled the weather. Two stories, written in two alphabets, pronouncing the same vow. Sometimes the evidence is architectural. Tufa cascades and travertine ledges climb down valley walls where springs ran and ran, building step after step in carbonates that only form when water flows without long interruptions. Terraces of these pale stones form natural amphitheaters, their edges rounded by the continuous fall of mineral-rich droplets, their embedded leaves and insect wings etched like brushstrokes into a pale fresco of constancy. Upstream, fan deltas spread in repeated tongues, each a quiet tongue of gravel and sand laid where a stream lost its nerve at the mouth of a lake that never shrank far enough to make them obsolete. There are marks of absence as well, silences we learn to value. Mud cracks vanish from long sections of the record where they would have been expected. Salt casts thin to near nothing. Evaporate layers retreat upslope or disappear from basins that once wore them annually like white collars. In those same basins, fish bones crowd horizons in delicate, undisturbed arrays, an assemblage that speaks to calm deposition and oxygenated bottom waters, paradoxical to storminess unless the storms were of the kind that feed without thrashing, filling the inflows but sparing the depths their violence. It is not the spectacle of a single flood we see. It is the steady stage management of a hydrologic system that has chosen amplitude over variability. All of these clues lean on timekeepers we have learned to trust. Magnetic grains, cooled past their Curie moments in volcanic ash layers, or aligned in sediments as they drape the planet's field, give us patterns we match to the global dance of polar reversals. The decay of isotopes, carbon in recent things, uranium into lead in crystals that outlast continents, pins pages to absolute years. Orbital rhythms, those gentle wobbles and tilts that pace the coming and going of seasons on grand scales, stand behind some of the wettest chapters. When precession pulls monsoon belts toward a basin and eccentricity amplifies the effect, we see the ink darken in sapropels, the cave bands thicken, the pollen charts pivot toward species that love dim and damp. The harmony among independent clocks and independent pens is what convinces us we are not chasing mirages. We walk field edges where ancient shorelines, etched as terraces, step across hills like ghost roads. We kneel in slick gullies to glove handfuls of clay that crumble into laminae under the gentlest pressure. We trace pebbles upstream with our eyes and find the precise lithology of their parent cliff. We hold a hand lens to a grain and watch the world it contains expand. Each observation feels small, like a raindrop counted in a storm, but their chorus is unmistakable. The planet does not shout about its long weathers. It accumulates evidence with the same patience the weather itself practiced, trusting that someone will arrive later with breath slow enough to hear. And when we do, and when we compare cave to lake, shore to shelf, pollen to isotope, we find the same sentence being written in different scripts, that there were ages when rain learned the power of perseverance, when clouds became climate, and when the land answered not with catastrophe, but with the incremental transformations only centuries of wet can bring. Light arrives here as a kindness rather than a guarantee, diffused through veils of cloud and layered canopies until it becomes texture more than brightness. Leaves answer by reshaping themselves into collectors, broad, thin surfaces with slick skins and tapered drip tips that usher water away from stomata that must breathe despite the constant wet. Each surface gleams with a varnish of moisture. Beads gather, join and fall in a measured cadence that sets the time for everything beneath. The forest has learned the grammar of dimness. Photosynthesis slows but steadies, trading speed for reliability, and plants invest in patience, denser veins, sturdier petioles, magazines of nutrients hidden in stems, and fronds for stretches when even the gentle light falters. Everywhere greens tilt toward deep mineral hues, and the understory recognizes itself, not as a shadow, but as its own world, with its own rules. Trunks rise like columns in a longhouse, their bark swaddled by mosses that creep upward in lush naps, their fissures hosting entire neighborhoods of life. Epiphytes, ferns, club mosses, and ancestral lineages that preceded flowers build hanging gardens from humus caught in forks and roughness, catching fog with the confidence of nets. Where flowering plants have already entered the story, they arrive with restraint, discreet pale blooms sheltered beneath leaves, nectar diluted but dependable, pollinators moving slowly because wings carry a little rain with every beat. Vines thread connections through the vertical space, ropes of living fiber that deliver both traffic and news. When one part of the canopy is tugged by wind or weight, the message travels the network and leaves adjust angles to shed a sudden spill or receive a passing gleam. The soundscape never empties. Rain writes a constant bass line, on leaf, on bark, on water already waiting. And into it, the creatures lay their instruments. Amphibians call with throats that shine like wet lanterns. Their notes are soft but numerous, 100 small questions answered by 100 soft replies. Insects rehearse delicate percussion, the clean tap of drops on wing covers, the faint rasp of mandibles cleaning condensation from antennae. Early mammals, nocturnal by habit and by heritage, move with careful certainty along branches damp as eels, their feet learning the locations where palm-sized lichens provide reliable traction. Reptiles bask in the brief windows when light consolidates enough to warm stone, and otherwise distill their motions to precision, conserving heat as if it were a secret shared only within family lines. Fungi run the city beneath the city. Mycelial threads knit soil into fabric, exchanging favors between root and root, ferrying phosphorus here, trading nitrogen there, keeping books in chemical currencies that work only when water keeps the ledger open. Fruiting bodies rise often, antlers and shelves, parasols and slim candles, and collapse just as often, their brief architectures returning to threads that will redraw themselves elsewhere tomorrow. Wood softens from within, its lignin negotiated down by communities that have specialized in the long conversation of rot. In the log's slow undoing, tunnels appear that channel air. A century of rain does not smother them, because porosity is a design shared by both decay and breath. Beetles find nurseries in those galleries, and the forest listens to the soft feed of larvae turning history into future soil. Along the forest floor, plants with ancestry from wetter, earlier ages keep a dignified tenure. Horsetails stand in regimented clusters where seepage runs, their jointed stems flicking droplets like metronomes. Giant club mosses, where they still hold ground, slide their scaly leaves over one another in overlapping armor that melts green into greener. Ferns broaden frond upon frond, each leaflet rimmed with a mirrored edge when the spray is fine. When sporangia ripen, they burst in quiet puffs, witnessed only by those already tuned to the miniature, dusting the damp air with spores that immediately find landing pads of moss and loam prepared by 1,000 falling threads. The cycles turn not as summers and winters, but as sequences of saturation and gust, overflow and lull, each phase long enough to feel like furniture. Where branches meet, pockets of water become rooms. Leaf axils host tiny pools that catch leaf litter, insect shells, and accidental pollen. Small crustaceans and larvae cycle through them as if they were lakes, their food webs efficient and intimate. In one pool, a carnivorous plant leans over with a pitcher-shaped leaf, offering a smooth-walled trap that fills from above whenever the rain rehearses its reliable role. The trap never runs dry, and its residents are as permanent as anything can be in a place devoted to flux. On larger scales, bromeliads, if they have entered the flora, arrange rosettes that vault the canopy and gather liters of rain at a time, becoming elevated wetlands where tree frogs hide their eggs, where mosquitoes develop in the company of predators that ensure the swarm never becomes the rule. The riverine margins modulate life like refrains. Channels here are rarely strict. They roam within belts of reed and sedge, pouring themselves into backwaters that blink like dark mirrors between buttress roots. Fish move inland during long highs, venturing through forests now towed by current, and their bodies carry nutrients upstream, releasing gifts in the form of scales, waste, and eventually bones that feed fungi and plants far from the sea. Turtles haunt the edges where fallen trunks lean, rising to nibble moss when the drizzle thins. Crocodilian forms where the epoch allows them, idle along slack meanders, as if carved from the maw of the river itself, their skin beaded not with sweat but with rain that cannot find a warmer invitation to vanish. Birds, whether they are ancestral gliders with more claw than wing or later flyers with feathers sealed by oils, adapt their schedules to the light's patience. They call more than they sing, short syllables sent near and often, navigating a world with fewer shadows and more reflections. Nests tend toward baskets with careful roofs, draped beneath thick leaves, or pressed into niches the rain has trouble discovering. Food is everywhere because everything grows, but digestion slows in the cool. Gizzards grind deliberately, and parents linger longer with each mouthful delivered to open beaks that glint with raindrops like glass pearls. When an insect hatch swells to a shimmering fog, the feeding feels more like harvesting than hunting. A scoop and swallow repeated with steady grace. The large plants rewrite their forms to carry an atmosphere that presses gently but constantly on every surface. Trunks broad at the base develop plates, flying buttresses that root into the floor like folded wings, because wet soil flows and must be resisted with geometry rather than brute force. Bark roughens to host water-breaking micro-topographies, turning sheer torrents into spreads of capillary trickles that nurture more moss, more liverwort, more tiny ferns. Canopy gaps, when they open under the slow fatigue of saturated wood, become green hurricanes that pull species from the seed bank to ground level. Pioneers with leaves that glitter thin and do not scald under improbable sun. Stems that leap in months to heights that usually take years. All of it conducted by the baseline of ongoing rain. Smells organize memory. Petrichor is constant enough to become background, yet it has shades that mark place and moment. The iron note of fresh lightning on stone, the green tea scent of crushed fern, the mushroom warmth of a log newly opened by termites. animals compose their maps with these gradients, following corridors of aroma that promise food or kin, dodging plumes that whisper of predators or sickness. Plants listen too. Volatile compounds drift and inform. Warnings transmitted leaf to leaf when a caterpillar chooses a vein or a fungus tests a wound. In a dry world, such signals can vanish into distance, but here they weave dense tapestries close to the ground, and responses arrive within minutes. Tannins increased, stomata narrowed, drip tips angled to sluice more clean water across a threatened surface. On slopes, the earth itself moves in millimeters, tree roots braid across and down, tying soil as if sewing, while mycorrhizae, fine as fog, lace those ties with a second seam. When a patch slides, it rarely tears free in violence. It creeps, folds, and lowers like a heavy blanket shifted by many hands, and seedlings ride the movement with a calm born of being anchored at a dozen points. In the wake, terraces form where none were planned, catching leaf fall and seed rain in shallow steps that become nurseries as soon as the next dawn collects in their hollows. Water, held longer by these accidental shelves, breeds midges that feed salamanders, that feed snakes, that choose stones warmed by that small hour's light, so that even unplanned geometry becomes a habitat, and even a slump is a kind of gardener. Night and day soften toward each other when clouds keep the extremes apart. Twilight lingers in leeward hollows, and the moon, when she glows behind weather, turns the canopy into a sheet of pewter with edges of tin. Owls, or their ancestors with broader tails and narrower heads, float through corridors of branches, as if dragged by the same currents that guide mist, their silent flight aided by humidity that dampens the very idea of noise. Beetles set out lanterns under their abdomens, milky glows that stutter as drops strike them, and the forest answers with a sweep of reflections from every wet surface. Hunting is a matter of timing more than speed. Patience earns more meals than chase, and ambush feels less like violence than a precise alignment of hunger and opportunity in a place that never truly sleeps and never fully wakes. Even the extremes here are gentle. When wind arrives, it is carried as pressure rather than blade, pressing the canopy into a single living sheet that bows and rises in slow motion breath. When cold visits, frost writes a lace at the farthest margins, quickly overwritten by the first hour's rain. When heat happens, it doesn't bite so much as loosen, and leaves droop not from thirst, but from the ease of lifting less. The forest's defenses mirror the climate's character: fewer thorns and more slippery skins, fewer explosive seeds and more ones that adhere with mucilage or travel short distances in the sheltered rivulets that thread every hollow. Each adaptation says the same thing in a different voice: endure, lean, exchange, rehearse. From the perspective of a single drop, the travel is intimate. It forms over a warm reach of sea, is lifted, welcomed into cloud, ferried inland by patterns that have learned their rounds. It pauses in a leaf cup, then slides to a trunk, then into soil that accepts it without question. It is sipped by a root and becomes a fraction of sap moving through the xylem toward a growing tip that will unfurl a new leaf to meet a light that may not arrive today. Or perhaps it joins the film along a salamander's skin, cooling it by a whisper. Or it joins a tiny stream and meets others until it becomes part of a pulse that will feed a channel for weeks. The drop is never lost, merely transferred, each handoff purposeful. And the forest, built from billions upon billions of such stories, continues to redo itself with materials that never leave the room. The result, a steadiness that feels less like balance and more like a vow. In this weather, memory becomes architecture. Seed banks thicken in the top few centimeters of soil, guarded by cold and wet that deter casual decay, ready to answer a patch of open sky with a green chorus that knows the words by heart. Animals build dens with drainage in mind first and comfort second, arranging exits not only for escape, but for the simplest movement of water downhill. Even insects pack their brood chambers with pellets shaped to resist collapse when the walls go glossy. The culture of the place, if a forest can be said to have culture, turns around the expectation that rain is not an event, but an element. Movement becomes choreography that accounts for slickness. Growth becomes a geometry that rehearses shedding. Hunger schedules itself to cycles of bloom and rot, rather than to a calendar that never needed to be invented. And still there are surprises, because repetition here is not monotony, but variation on a theme. A tree falls and opens a room-wide skylight. A ridge captures an eddy of cloud and nurses a pocket of rare orchids whose roots plait around each other like stories. A pond extends a finger into leaves and persuades a lineage of fish to stay, shrinking into plate-sized permanence, yet nourishing a carnival of larvae and small mouths. A boulder, colonized by lichens that prefer the fine spray of a certain bend, accrues a rind of color so slow and so exact that it becomes a clock only the patient can read. The forest becomes an encyclopedia of small specialties, each one depending on wetness, each one contributing to the wetness by trapping fog, shading soil, slowing runoff, raising humidity, and then handing the gift back again in a feedback that feels like affection made physical. First, the line between blue and brown loosens, not as a single event, but as a habit the coast learns, and water begins to try new shapes on the land. Tides swell over flats that once dried daily to a thin crust of salt and silt, but now stay glazed, mirror smooth between ripples that remember the last breeze. The river mouths open wider, not by tearing, but by relaxing, and their plumes unfurl into the sea like silk poured from a high bowl, fresh atop salt, pale atop deep, carrying a breath of soil far beyond any root's reach. Sandbars reorganize themselves like courteous furniture, shifting a little to make room whenever the flood arrives, bearing its fine gifts. What had been boundary becomes gradient, brackish today, a little fresher with a week's rain, a little saltier on a wind that draws the outer ocean in, the difference written not as a line on a map, but as a taste in the mouth and a change in which grasses bow first. Estuaries elongate like vowels. They find the ancient troughs left by glaciers and older rivers, and they follow them inland with confidence, laying carpets of mud that gleam at low water like dark glass. Here, each bend becomes a nursery. Nursery for fish with bodies still soft as questions. Nursery for crustaceans that scuttle sideways through new alphabets of current and quiet. Nursery for plants that lace their roots in knitted densities, sturdy enough to catch a falling heron's step. The water carries stories from both parents, minerals, tannins, silts from the river, salts, diatoms, and steady temperature from the sea. And in the mixing, new characters appear. Flocks of clay gather, as if remembering a meeting they were meant to attend, then sink and layer the bottom in blankets that comfort benthic creatures into setting up rooms with doors that face both upstream and out. Deltas respond like generous hands. Distributary channels split and fan, each fingertip testing a different depth and slope, each leaving its own signature of sand at the mouth and a trailing ribbon of silt behind. During long, wet decades, the river does not hurry to choose. It spreads its bets, climbs upon itself in levees knit from the very mud it delivers, and when a crest overtops, it spills into a neighboring low and writes a new line across the marsh with a crevasse splay, like a sigh. Overwash from distant storms throws thin sheets of sand landward, quiet fans that are more suggestion than command. And the marsh answers not with resistance, but with accommodation, catching the grains in root combs and building elevation one filament at a time. From above, the shape resembles a lung, bronchi dividing into bronchioles into alveoli, where water exchanges its silt for stillness, the landscape itself breathing slowly under a roof of weather. Barrier islands begin their gentle dance, long and lean, parallel to the mainland like sentences written in the same hand. They migrate without complaint, a step landward in a season that stacked the tide a little higher, a sideways drift when longshore currents thumbed sand from one end to the other, an occasional split that becomes a new inlet where the estuary requested a door. Behind them, lagoons sweeten and salt in patient alternation, their floors carpeted with the shells of creatures that never travelled far but multiplied with the confidence of calm. Each storm that crosses is less a destroyer than a page-turner, lifting the island and setting it down a little closer to its future, dropping washover aprons that glitter with mica and crushed shell, these new surfaces immediately colonized by runners of grasses, whose blades sing whenever the wind rehearses its steady lines. Smell begins to organize the map here as much as sight. The air at the head of a bay carries peat and leaf tannin, a tea-brown sweetness that lingers on the tongue. Farther out, iodine and a faint metallic thread recall miles of invisible plankton, giving the sun a way into the food web. You can close your eyes and tell where the river rules and where the sea has the louder voice, even when the water, held in cloud, is falling evenly on both. Gulls or their ancient analogues sketch letters on the sky's wet page, turning where scent and shimmer tell them small fish are herding copepods against a boundary. Wading birds lift their knees high through eelgrass that offers no resistance to legs, evolved elsewhere but adapted quickly to the polite pull of brackish current. Life answers with forms suited to ambiguity. Fishes carry gills that tolerate change without fuss, flipping a handful of switches at the ion level whenever the tide recites a different stanza. Some grow in place, larvae shifting to juveniles in the same channel where the light's angle first found their eyes. Then, when the bones harden, follow the taste of salt out along the distributary that best matches their remembered chemistry. Others arrive from the ocean wide, pushing in on spring tides to broadcast eggs over quiet shallows, warmed by the color of suspended river silt. Crabs test burrows with claws more delicate than they look, practicing a daily commute up and down the salinity gradient, like commuters in an ancient city who know exactly when the market opens and which street is quickest on a south wind. Plants draw maps with their bodies. Where the water pauses and lifts only rarely, sedges and rushes gather in careful hummocks, each tuft a raft that traps more mud, that raises itself by an inch each year until a footpath for snails appears around its waist. A little lower, where the tide comes with reliability but restraint, shrubs adapted to both air and brine send down roots that grow vertical straws, pneumatophores or something like them, to sip oxygen from a thickness of mud that would otherwise ask too much. Lower still, where the floor is a carpet of finely sorted silt, grasses accept the daily brushing of water and the weekly burial by thin films of fresh sediment, as if these attentions were grooming rather than hazard, and they repay the favor by baffles that persuade the tide to lay down the next gift a little earlier and a little more gently. Every creature here becomes a courier of substance from one realm to another. When fish feed offshore and rest inshore, they carry ocean nitrogen into the marsh, night by night, exhaling it at the roots of plants that thread their days in the cadence of the tide. When birds nest on higher ground but harvest at low tide, they ferry phosphates onto the lee side of dunes, and grasses there answer with a deeper green and hold sand that much more firmly. When storms lift rafts of wrack, a braided mix of seagrass blades, reeds, and beetle-eaten leaves, and set them down over a newly formed mudflat, the raft breaks itself into a dozen compost islands, each the perfect launching pad for seedlings stored in the soil's patient memory, a mosaic of beginnings that unroll at the pace of cloudy light. The physics keeps its gentle arithmetic even as the scene grows elaborate. River discharge repeated above a long average raises base level in the channels, so the energy for scour turns into energy for spread. Water loses its speed across the sudden roominess of an estuary and lets go of its heaviest grains first, then its fines in a slow hush that thickens the floor as steadily as a quilt. Wave climate matters, but even feisty seas are softened by the new geometry. Fetch shortens behind barriers, and chop becomes pattern rather than pressure. The Coriolis habit nudges surface waters to one side, making one bank of a bay saltier, one fresher, the two separated by a seam that moves with the wind like a cat's attention. The seam is busy. Larval forms gather here as if drawn by magnets, and foam writes cursive long after anyone watching has learned to read. Subtle tectonics, always in session beneath any landscape, lend either a hand or a patient drag. If the crust is subsiding by a whisper, accommodate becomes the rule, and the estuary lengthens with little encouragement. If it is rising by the thickness of a fingernail each year, the river and the sea negotiate different clauses. River delivering more sediment, marshes growing taller, barrier islands keeping pace by borrowing sands from their own flanks and redepositing them in storms that arrive with the regularity of myth. None of this is crisis. It is choreography in slow time, the kind that allows rehearsals so long that missteps become stylings, and every participant learns to read the other's breath before the notes themselves are sounded. Some places learn to glow. In quiet nights, when the tide slips in under a sky that forgot to show stars, and the rain falls in a mist that behaves like dust blown from the ocean's library, plankton light in response to touch, and each raindrop stamps a small blue coin that fades as another lands beside it. Fish cut cold fire with their flanks, turning as schools do, and their curves write sentences you feel tempted to translate. In the morning, the seams of light are gone, replaced by a grey that feels soft to the eye. But on the mud, you can see where shoals of tiny mouths graze the algae film. Their paths, like the stitching on a garment you wore so long, it learned the shape of you. Up creek, the inland water becomes audience to the ocean's voice. The daily rise is a hand on the shoulder of the river, patient and regular, encouraging it to slow and listen. Trees along the bank learn to drink with care, timing their uptake to the hours when the brackish pulse is weakest, their leaves thickened against the occasional taste of salt in the xylem, their seeds buoyant enough to float past a bend if the current asks them to travel. In flood years that become flood generations, these same banks do not stand as walls. They step down into terraces of roots and silt that let the river spread itself without tearing. Between the steps, backwaters nap under rafts of duckweed and ancestral analogues, their surfaces broken by the snouts of animals that learned long ago to rest between fresh and salt, to be at home in compromise. The language of sound changes with distance from the open horizon. At the mouth, you hear the rumored weight of swell, an authority under all other noise. A mile inland, the sound is lace, the hiss of rain on reeds, the tick of periwinkles against stems, the quiet clink of shell moved an inch by water, too courteous to push. Farther still, the estuary's music becomes domestic, the bubble of small ebbs down tiny steps, the murmur of rills cutting under mats of roots, the breathy purl of wind exhaling through seed heads. None of it is loud, all of it is continuous, and in that continuity, animals find the confidence to feed with their heads down and their eyes half closed, because interruption is rare and danger announces itself by violating tempo. As the long weather continues, maps that once showed a simple coast begin to bristle with subtlety. Creeks that never earned a name swell into fingers worth labeling. Shoals that were temporary last long enough to sport low shrubs and the nests of birds who like dry feet with wet horizons. Channels that were strangers grow close and exchange flows in slack water, linking watersheds into new families, wide enough to support migrations that had never been possible. And the sediment pyramid in the delta grows not by height, but by area, a banquet table extended at the edges, its dishes replenished each season from upstream kitchens that grind mountain into flour, hill into spice. Even the sun behaves differently when reflected from so many new angles. On broken water, it lays a path you can walk with your eyes. On wet mud, it polishes relief into a script of ripples and crab tracks. On reed blades, it beads itself into necklaces that fall, reform, and fall again. Clouds find themselves mirrored in marsh ponds with such fidelity that birds attempt to fly through the copy, then veer at the last second with the ease of reflex, and the echo of their wing beats rolls low over the grass like a cat purr scaled to acres. The wetland does not store water only in hollows. It stores it in air, in the breath of plants, in the patience of soils, in the capillaries of roots, and the pores within every granule of humus, so that even when a tide draws back and the rain rests for a day, moisture remains as presence rather than memory. There are places along this growing edge where ancient shells pile into low mounds, rings upon rings of meals taken where fresh met salt, where a channel promised fish at every moon. Whether those shells were assembled by birds, otters, ancestors of our line, or some committee of all three in different ages, hardly matters to the larger shape. The mounds lift land a little, capture seed a little more, and become high points where the first shrubs take hold, where spiders throw threads that catch both mist and small flying lives. Each small height then births a shadow that cools the ground, a shelter that redirects wind, a complexity that persuades a channel to curl more tightly and lay down another layer of silt just so. And in that, just so, the next platform emerges, a stepping stone for the ocean to continue its polite walk inland. If you were to measure the world here, not by miles, but by transitions, it would be dense with distance, the meter where freshwater algae become marine films, the yard where a grass's courage to tolerate salt fails and a succulent takes over, storing brine in leaves that glisten like wet pebbles, the steppe where a crab prefers a burrow with a roof and a fish prefers the open pool at its mouth, the breath between a wind from upriver smelling of leaf and a wind from the bar tasting of stone. Each threshold is soft-edged, well-used, adjusted daily by tide and rain, and the patient, blind work of roots, and each adds to the sense that the coast is not a margin, but a fabric being woven with more threads each season, the loom itself made of water that refuses to choose and therefore continues to connect. At first, it is only a rumour in the light, a thinness to the cloud's weave, a brighter seam wandering along the horizon as if someone tugged the curtain a finger's width. The rain continues because habit is strong, but each drop feels a little less certain, a fraction smaller, as though the sky has begun to count them. Wind arrives from a new quarter with a drier voice, slipping between hills without gathering mist, and valleys notice that echoes travel farther. Morning has edges again, shadows, faint as pencil, begin to sketch the undersides of leaves, and whenever the sun presses its palm through the gauze, the forest inhales as one body, surprised to feel warmth that lingers for more than a breath. Water answers first in the small places. Puddles that used to overlap retreat to their original outlines, revealing pebbles that forgot their colours under months of grey. Soil, always patient, opens its pores and releases a soft breath. You can smell mineral, unmasked, now that the constant rinsing has paused. On trunks, rivulets break into beaded chains, then into single drops that hang and regard the world with a round, glassy eye before falling. The hymn of drip-shed drip thins to distinct notes instead of a sheet of sound. And in the pause between notes, a beetle's footfall seems suddenly extravagant. Spiders rebuild webs not only to catch, but to dry. Geometry tightens, angles sharpen. Silk sings a little when air moves across it without the weight of mist. In open places, the sky experiments with colour. Blue returns shyly in small panes, then larger. The white of clouds clarifies into towers with carved faces and shadows of their own. The sun's touch on water is a statement rather than a rumour, laying a path across ponds and backwaters that draws fish upward to investigate the sudden mirror. Insects discover thermals and practice spirals, their wings no longer carrying a library of tiny droplets. Where the estuary breathes, low tides last a little longer, revealing newly ridged mud that holds the handwriting of crabs and the staccato sidesteps of birds with bright ankles. Salt dries into faint crystals around the edges of reeds, and when the wind lifts, a whisper of dust rises that has been denied its sentence for generations. Plants, tuned to minutes as well as months, revise their postures. Leaves that held themselves flat to sip diluted light start to cant and angle for precision. Stomata lengthen their open hours. Pigments that defend against glare awaken from storage and tint the canopy toward richer greens and cautious golds. Drip tips do not retire, but they go quiet, work in afternoons instead of whole days. Buds that waited for a cue unfurl with a deliberation that seems swift only by comparison to the long grey. Some arrive pale, as if the colour is travelling to them from the roots and deepen across a single noon. Vines loosen their grip on neighbouring stems just enough to test unsupported reaches, crossing new meters of air made possible by dryness that holds them steady rather than sliding them back. Fungi, maestros of the wet orchestra, modulate. Fruiting bodies that erupted weakly now select sites beneath logs and in the seam between rock and soil, sanctuaries where the atmosphere still tastes like earlier months. Mycelia pull back from the surface by a thumb's breadth, settling into a cooler, steadier zone. And the forest, grateful but rebalancing, routes more of its commerce through roots and less through the ever-present skin of moisture that once connected everything. Rot slows from a fluent conversation to a thoughtful exchange. Logs keep their shape a season longer. The sweet, warm smell of decomposition yields the stage to resin, leaf, warmed bark. Ants open new doors on their mounds facing morning. Termites draft galleries that cross air for the first time in memory and harden to pale paper in hours. Animals change their clocks with a precision born of opportunity. Amphibians retreat from the open, thicken their skins a shade, and choose pools that now hold their boundaries. Their songs become evening events rather than all-day murmurs, and the pauses fill with crickets tempted into bravado by heat. Birds spread their drying wings at dawn, not as emergency, but as ritual, then climb. The vertical space above the canopy, once a damp attic, becomes a road they remember from deeper time. They stitch distances in long, steady lines, and return with stories of thermals and the glint of distant water that the ground has not seen for years. Small mammals expand their foraging circles, lightly stepping onto stones that used to hide beneath a film of glossy runoff, and their tracks last into the next day, a written record of decisions made under a clearer sky. Rivers discover their shape again. They pull in their shoulders, straighten a little where mud cannot insist, and lay down slender bars of new sand, bright as linen. Backwaters do not vanish. They choose a slower cadence, becoming libraries for the silt that still arrives from hillsides, adjusting to a different balance of wet and dry. The water clarifies by degrees, green deepening to brown only after rain, and never as an unbroken thought. Fish relearn to hunt by sight, and there is a moment each afternoon when narrow beams of sun comb the water column and outline every suspended mote, a constellation settling toward the bed. Where banks had been composed of saturated quilt, they firm, and roots knit them tighter. When the river sighs after a brief shower, it stays inside its own story. Along the coast, the air recalibrates its agreements with the sea. Mornings carry coolness inland, before land-warmed evenings send it back. Breezes learn a diurnal grammar that braids with tide to make days feel counted again. Barrier dunes hold. Their grasses change tone, rattling dryly at noon, whispering softer at night. Salt spray leaves a sugar-fine crust that no longer dissolves immediately. Beetles write hieroglyphs through it that catch dawn light like silver. In marshes, water levels waver around a mean that lowers by inches in a dozen fortnights, exposing peaty shoulders where new seedlings stake flags with roots that favor both oxygen and optimism. The estuary retains its talent for mixing, but now it includes a chapter on clearing. And in the clear, you can see the clockwork of small lives that kept time under the rain's long hum. Mountains, always quiet directors in the wings, lift the new pattern with hardly visible gestures. The lee goes sunlit for hours at a stretch, eddies of air warm as they descend and comb fog back toward ridgelines where it gathers into banners rather than blankets. Snow, if the epoch allows it, begins to consider the high saddles again. But for now, the change is in chrome. Wet slate becomes dry slate, and the precise fracture of stone sounds sharp when a goat or its ancestor crosses. Above tree line, cushions of archaic plants show tiny flowers no one noticed in the old weather. In the new sun, they glow like coins set in green felt, and bees or proto-bees find them by scent that travels farther in air no longer saturated with itself. The sky's machinery, always present, reveals its gears. High clouds slide on invisible rails from a different ocean. Mid-level decks break into streets that march toward evening. The low, seamless ceiling of the long storm lifts and dissolves into separate actors, each with its cue. Pressure rises in increments. The barometer's needle, if anyone were there to watch, would creep like moss across a stone in a long exposure. Thunder, when it speaks, does so with final clauses rather than long arguments. Lightning writes fewer lines, and the carbon scars it leaves on bark are thin, healed over by the next season's cambium, such that they read more like memories than wounds. In the soils, chemistry learns a new tempo. Redoxymorphic mottles fade upward. Iron, given air, oxidizes into steady color that no longer pools and drains. Clays shrink a breath. Hairline cracks appear and do the quiet work of admitting air deeper, which invites new roots to test rooms they had avoided. Microbes capable of aerobic feats multiply and invent faster routes for the decay of leaf litter, releasing smells of spice and hay into afternoons that hold heat. Seed banks feel the rearrangement and trigger contingents that had waited not for light only, but for the particular signal of warmth without saturation. The cohort that rises bears waxed leaves, thicker cuticles, hairs that hide stomata in shade, small strategies for spending water with accounting rather than with faith. Even creatures of the long rain keep their place by invention. Salamanders choose stones that shade deeper fissures, their roots between seep and thicket lengthen by yards and become burrows, maintained with a diligence that looks like art. Snails retreat during noon and write glossy sutures across their shells at evening, growth rings stained faintly by new minerals liberated from dry rock. Dragonflies, whose nymphs once had an unbroken kingdom of calm water, accept a river with faster muscles, and their adult bodies arrow and stall with a command of air their lineage had only partly used. Predators revise patience. Ambush shifts from indefinite to timely, strikes keyed to light angles rather than to the drown of sound, and meals grow leaner but more frequent. The long hydrologic feedbacks adjust with the grace of experienced dancers changing partners. Evaporation from canopy declines by a fraction. Transpiration rises. The mix of the two makes afternoons interesting in a way mornings cannot predict. Clouds form later, taller, and travel farther before their thoughts fall back as rain that now arrives as punctuation rather than prose. The ground cools at night more than it used to. Dew replaces drizzle as the small benediction on leaves. In dawn light, each droplet lenses a tiny, inverted forest, the world rediscovered one bead at a time. Breezes find corridors that were once filled with downdraft curtains of water. Scents carry messages to distances that widen territories and complicate courtships in ways that feel like luxury. In human time, if we had been there to mark it, traditions would shift with the sky. Roofs would grow lighter by a handspan. Doorways would face breezes we name. Fabrics would dry on lines strung between buttresses that now act as porches. Fires, once reluctant, would welcome sparks on the first try and add a new note of cedar to the afternoon. Calendars would invent themselves around first clearings, longest shadows, a week without lightning. The day the pool at the bend took on the color of tea instead of slate. Children would learn stories that include blue by name, and elders would argue in a friendly way whether the old hours sounded softer because of the rain or because of how the rain taught listening. Yet nothing is abrupt enough to unteach the land what it knows. The marsh still filters. The river still translates mountain into valley. Caves still count with calcite ink. Forests still knit water into their bodies and hand it back with interest. What changes is weight and timing, tilt and emphasis, and the world responds with new flexibilities layered atop old strengths. A hillside, now drying along the top few inches each afternoon, sends tiny, dust-laced thermals that invite hawks to draw circles. The same hillside, still moist in its heart, feeds a spring that never misses morning. A beach, somewhat wider by the work of wind, hosts a line of plants that traps sand a foot higher. The lagoon behind it, now clearing a little after each tide, raises minnows under light that reaches the shallow benthos and calls out colors that were there all along, but hidden in grey. Evidence accrues in places we have learned to read. Lake cores begin to lay their summer laminations again, coarser over finer couplets that hold the rhythm of quiet between pulses. Cave bands thin, becoming distinct and intricate, a lace of high and low that says drip persisted, but considered its schedule. Pollen counts lean toward species that tolerate brightness. Diatoms in estuary mud tell of clearer water with the same calm confidence they once used to report flood-fed turbidity. Charcoal specks reappear, not from catastrophe, but from cool fires that pass lightly through litter in afternoons when the air holds a little less water, and a spark does what sparks do when given a dignified job. The mind, if it lives here, revises what it expects of the hour. Instead of the certainty of rain, it learns the art of looking up and being surprised by the unopened possibility of blue. Instead of the soft, unpunctuated murmur of wet on leaf, it tastes the pleasure of cicadas counted and counted again, of wind reading a new script through pine, of dry grass describing a cat's progress. Feet find old stones that used to be slick and report a new confidence to the hips, which pass it to the back, which passes it to the eyes. Posture changes, gait changes, then habits, then thoughts. In the evening, when the western sky holds its glow past reasonable expectations, everything that breathes seems to stretch a fraction, as if making room inside for a larger room outside. Trees that were sculpted by centuries of weight begin quiet projects. Growth rings laid down under constant cloud were narrow, but many. Now a few widen, not greedily, but in a measured way, the cambium voting yes on a proposal to lift a little higher in 3 seasons' time. Branches grow shorter twigs that hold leaves at angles unfamiliar to the old arrangement. Small solar fields learning to focus. Roots send scouts toward depths that promise both moisture and reliable oxygen, diversifying in silence the way merchants diversify cargo for a route rumored to be less predictable but more rewarding. Woodpeckers discover that a dry trunk carries sound farther and drum longer, and the forest develops a beat that had been absent so long even the stones seem to listen for it. On nights when the moon stands without a veil, predators who trusted smell and vibration add sight to their repertoire. Eyeshine pricks the edges of reeds and the shoulders of logs. Paths widen. The organization of space changes. Prey rehearse new routes that zigzag between shadow patches stitched by leaves no longer wed to cloud. Their hearts run a fraction faster at first, and then steady as the novelty becomes custom. Owls practice the old trick of silence in a new air that carries their passage less with the damp's heavy hand and more with a fine brush. They compensate with even softer feathers, a labor paid back by success, counted in small bones that dry clean by morning beneath favorite perches. Where mountains feed plains, the old fans reawaken. Channels on alluvial spreads braid less wildly, pick favorites, and carve banks that hold past a single season. In the new stability, plants move in with roots that resist shear. Stems reinforce margins. Seed heads toss light across afternoons that belong to bees. The fine silt that once smoothed every surface into uniform softness now organizes into ribbons and patches. When wind does rise, it lifts this dust in sheets so delicate they look like light escaping, and carries it to settle as a thin fertility far downwind, a note folded into future fields. The ocean, patient as stone, acknowledges the shift without drama. Swell lines sharpen. The color of the near shore deepens without the constant infusion of river milk. Kelp or its epical kin anchor more confidently as clarity allows light to reach a handspan deeper. Terns discover that hovering is easier over water that returns a consistent picture. They poise longer and fall with a neatness that scores the surface with a single new punctuation mark before smoothing follows. Farther out, the seam where currents meet learns a different address and writes it into the travel diaries of animals that have always accepted change as the main rule. Their routes bend, not break, and the bend becomes a tradition in a generation. Nothing here claims finality, only adjustment. Rain does not depart. It renegotiates, returns as visit rather than residence, as an ensemble player rather than the lead. When it comes, the land greets it without surprise and without the long fatigue that once shrouded everything. Gullies take it in and pass it along. Wetlands file it carefully. Bedrock lifts it into springs, whose voices now include undertones of distance crossed under sun. When it pauses, the pause is an invitation to habits that had been in storage, to techniques for using light and shadow, heat and cool, to ways of being that had a place in memory and now reacquire a place on the map. The sky, loosened from a single mood, shows an anthology of faces, and the world, reading each with growing fluency, continues its work with the same meticulous calm it brought to centuries of rain, only now with a few more tools within reach. Thank you for drifting through deep time with me tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The world can wait. If you enjoyed this quiet journey, tap like and subscribe so the next story finds you. Tell me which moment stayed with you, or where in the world you listened from, and what you'd like to explore next. Until then, breathe slow, rest well, and I'll meet you in the next chapter of history's long night. Good night.